If you're a visitor this morning, I would like to welcome you to First Baptist Van Buren. I have, as they mentioned earlier, I have family that attend this church. Please don't hold Ron against me. But I also have several friends that go to church here, and I know this is a great place to call home. For those of you who are resident members, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning with you. I always look forward to the opportunity to proclaim the Word of God wherever the church may be and whatever the context is, but it's always a great privilege and pleasure to do it with people that you know and love. This morning, if you will, turn to Deuteronomy 13 with me. As you turn over to Deuteronomy 13, I want to take you back to a brief period of United States history. If you will, imagine yourself walking along a sidewalk somewhere, perhaps Fort Smith, Arkansas, or here in Van Buren, the downtown area, on January 2nd, 1939. So you're walking down the street, you pass a newsstand, and what do you see? Well, there's the local papers, but among those local papers, January 2nd, 1939, is the first episode, the first edition of the year for Time magazine. And if you are a reader of Time magazine, you'll know that the first edition of the year is when they publish the Man of the Year. All right, so January 2nd, 1939, we're talking about the Man of the Year for 1938. Who might it be? Well, if we look at inventions for the year, we are all indebted to a man by the name of Laszlo Biro. Laszlo Biro invented the ballpoint pen. Many of you will take notes with his pen this morning. But no, he was not the Man of the Year. Some of you may think, well, if you know inventions, especially some of you who are in the printing business, there was a man by the name of Chester Carlston. He invented the photocopier in 1938. Of course, that is a great invention. Well, perhaps, maybe it was in the realm of entertainment. After all, the United States and much of the world was recovering from a Great Depression that spanned because of one world war, and the country was on the brink of a second world war. Perhaps Walt Disney was the Man of the Year for 1938. After all, while he released it in December of 1937, 1938 was the heyday of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, one of his most popular cartoons. If you were to think it was any of those people, which I know all of you are just really interested in 1938, you would be wrong. The Man of the Year for 1938 was none other than the Chancellor of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. You heard me. That's right. If you go back and you read the article, one of the things that the article does point out, it does point out how brutish and how cruel he has treated some of the people there in Germany. But it just applauds and it just recognizes his leadership abilities and how he was able to lead that country from the brink of depression. The United States had a bad depression in the 1930s. We all know that. We've all gone through American history. But Germany, it was worse. The country was torn by war. Buildings were destroyed. There were no businesses, houses. People didn't have places to work. They didn't have shelters to cover their head. They didn't have food to eat. They couldn't provide the bare necessities to make it. And here comes this man into a country that has no hope, and he offers them hope. They have no houses, and he says, let's build houses and let's get you places to live. They have no food. They're starving to death. And he says, let's create farms, and that creates jobs, and that creates food for everyone, and we all can eat, and we can be full. And these people who were hopeless traded in that hope, that hopelessness, to a sense of hope, but to the tune of 6 million Jews. Some 3,500 years prior to that, we see the same situation taking place here in Deuteronomy 13. You've got to realize the people of Israel, they had been wandering in the wilderness for about 40 years at this point. And it wasn't just some wandering. They had seen all sorts of things that the Lord had done. But as they wandered, because of disobedience, an entire generation was dying off. That may not sound like a whole lot. We may think, well, that's 500 people, 1,000 people. No, it was more likely the tune of 500,000 people had died off in a span of 40 years. They were tired. They wanted a place to call home. They were hopeless. And when we're hopeless, we can often hold on to those things that give us hope, those idols. The central idea of the message this morning that I want you to get, the central idea of this passage, the timeless truth, is that remembering God and His Word, it enables us to recognize and remove those temptations which often come from unlikely sources. Let's look at the first temptation that we see this morning. The first temptation that we see is those of leaders who they say and they do great things, but their focus is not on God. Look with me in Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 through 5. It says, "If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives a sign or a wonder, and the sign and wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, 'Let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them,' you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." Verse number 4. "You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear Him and keep His commandments and obey His voice, and you shall serve Him and hold fast to Him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way which the Lord commanded you to walk. So you shall purge evil from your midst." The first threat that we see this morning to the hope of Israel, to see the threat that keeps them from entering the promised land, that Moses is warning them about, are those leaders who they say and they do good things, and yet their focus is not on God. Now, if you were to do a brief survey here of the book of Deuteronomy, you see some things. It's not like we're just picking this up in the middle of the story. You see, the first 8 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is somewhat retelling them their history, reminding them, you were captives in the land of Egypt. And I, Moses, with the help of the Lord, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And we all know the story of how the Pharaoh said, "I will harden my heart, I won't let your people go." And we all know that story. So Moses retells him that story, and he gets to the point in chapter 9 of Deuteronomy in which he recalls his incident of going up to Mount Sinai. He gets the 10 Commandments, and lo and behold, he comes down, and what does he find? The people all had feared that Moses went up to the mountain and he's dead. So here we are in the wilderness. We don't have a leader anymore. The best we've got is Aaron. So Aaron, here's our gold. Make us a calf that we can worship. And of course, Aaron, he follows the will of the people. This is the very leader that Moses is talking about. Aaron had done and seen many great things. Remember, Moses, when he was originally called by the Lord, said, "Lord, I can't go. I have a stuttering problem. I can't speak very clearly." And so the Lord said, "I will appoint Aaron for you to go and to speak on your behalf." So the people had seen Aaron as a mouthpiece that the Lord had used to do great and mighty things. And yet he had led them astray. You think about in the very same story that Moses had told them, maybe in chapters 1 through 8, about them leaving Egypt. Do you remember that passage when it goes back and you read it in Exodus chapter 7 through 11? Do you remember that passage where Moses went in and he would show the sign to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh would call his magicians, and his magicians, they could do the very same thing that Moses could do. You remember that? The frogs, the water turned into blood, the gnats, the sores. Every single one of those, the magicians were able to duplicate. They could do magic. And here is what Moses is saying. He's saying, just because someone can do something that amazes you, just because he talks the right talk, and maybe he walks the walk talk, the defining characteristic that you can see in him is if he says, "Let's go after another god," he's saying, you put him to death. You see, often when we look at this, we focus only on the problem. If you remember that as we were reading through it, we really see that problem exemplified in verses 1 through 3. Moses is talking about if this person rises up, if they say this, if they say that. But he gives us a solution. He doesn't just say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. So often that's what we're in the mindset of doing, is saying, don't do this. I have a kid, trust me, I know. I like to, more often than not, I have to say, Kinsey, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. But isn't it more effective as a parent if you're able to say, hey, you need to stop doing this. Why don't you come do this? You somewhat divert their attention. Well, the Lord, He knows that. So then he offers us that solution of, you shall walk after the Lord and his commandments, you shall fear him and keep his commandments. This wasn't an unusual thought to these people. The way that they were supposed to recognize these evil leaders who said and did the amazing things that tried to lead them away, the way they were supposed to recognize them is keeping in focus the commandments and word of the Lord. A place that this is demonstrated very well is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and following. I'll read just a portion of it. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Does that sound somewhat similar to what we just read here in chapter 13? And these words that I've commanded you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house. And you shall talk of them when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And verse 8 says, You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house, and on your gates. When Moses is telling the people that they are to walk after the Lord their God in verse 4, and they are to fear him and keep his commandments, he's not giving them just an abstract idea of, well, go do it and figure out how to do it in the best way possible. He's already instructed them. In making application to that in our own life, I think about as a child growing up. I grew up in Louisiana on a farm. My dad, he's got about 200 acres, and he raises cattle, and he plants about a 12 or 15 acre garden. I grew up outside. And my wife and I have talked often about my communication with my dad. Because the way that my dad and I have communicated throughout the years wasn't, well, let's sit down and go grab a cup of coffee and let's talk about things. And it wasn't, let's call Dad up and let's have this phone conversation that lasts 30 minutes. Dee Dee can testify. When I'm on the phone with Dad, we talk business, we talk weather, he asks how the family is, and about 3.5 minutes later, I'm off the phone with him. That's how it works. The way that my dad had an impact on me was through those moments of when we were going to the feed store to pick up a load of sweet feed. Or when we were working on a tractor. Or perhaps when we were hunting on those Saturday mornings and we were on the way back from the deer stand to the house. And he would just impress on my mind things about working and doing your work unto the Lord. And treating others with respect because that's how the Lord has commanded you. And treating others with grace because God has extended so much grace to you. And that is what Moses is telling us here in this passage. In your daily, everyday life, it doesn't have to be this spiritual moment of, let's pull out our Bible and let's talk about, let's just break this passage down. Yes, that's great. But it could be as simple as, when you're walking through a business and you have someone that you know is a follower of Christ, talk to them about it. When you're doing something with your kids, just talk to them about it. It's as simple as that. Because you see, this people, they were wanting something to grab hold of so badly that if someone were to rise up that could do the same signs as Moses and said, hey, let's follow these other gods, they were probably off to the races. Their track record had showed that, and as you look a little bit further into the passage and they cross over in the promised land in the book of Joshua, it doesn't take them very long to repeat the sins of their fathers. I want you to notice that this is just some casual person. It's not anyone specific that they know. But the second threat that we see in this passage is one that Moses, he brings it a little bit closer to home for us. Literally, he brings it closer to home. The second threat that we see are those close relationships that they lead away from God. Look with me in verse 6 and following. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or your daughter, or the wife who you embrace, or your friend who is your own soul, entices you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, some of the gods of the people who are around you, whether near you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not yield to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him, nor shall you conceal him, but you shall kill him. Your hand shall be the first against him. You shall put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. You shall stone him to death with stones, because he sought to draw you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and all Israel shall hear and fear, and never do any such wickedness as this among you. Now, isn't that just encouraging? Go pick up those stones and those relationships that are leading you away from the Lord. You pick up the stones, and we'll have a stoning party out here in the parking lot after church today, right? Well, let's think about that a little bit. Because I do want you to realize this is a real thing. Moses was really telling them, if your wife, if your husband, if your son, if your daughter, if your best friend, those people who are nearest and dearest to your heart, if they try to lead you away from the Lord, you take them outside and you stone them to death. We'll get to that in a moment. I want you to think about that, and I want that to ruminate in your mind. But there's something I want you to see before we get there. Did you notice at the end of verse 6, it says, your friend who as your own soul, he entices you. How does he entice you? Does he telegraph it? Does he smoke signal it? Does he walk out and say, hey, everybody? No, he does it secretly. He does it secretly. While it's not the primary application of this passage, it certainly is an application. If you seek to follow the Lord, if you seek to walk after Him, if you seek to live your life in a way that is pure and acceptable to Him, what does this passage imply? It implies you have to be a person of integrity. I've heard a pastor say before, if somehow or another we could have videotaped the last year of your life and really put it on the big screens up here today and just fast forward it through, except those moments that you're not very proud of, that you've tried to sweep under the carpet and keep them hidden, we would all be very embarrassed with the way that we've acted. Right? But you know what? God sees and knows everything that we do. He knows the things that we see on the computer. He knows the things that we do when we are out of town on business trips. He knows that 1040 form that you just filled out and turned in. He knows what you recorded on there and what the actual amounts were. This passage, while it is a call, the second threat is a call that close relationships, they'll lead us away from God. Before we can really start looking at those relationships, we have to realize that you have to be a person of integrity before you can really start to examine those relationships. Now, like I said before, Moses told them to take them outside and to stone them, to get rid of the threat altogether. It was a real time in history. It was a real command that he told them to do. And so we don't need to make light of that. But the passage is still very applicable to us today. I want you to think of something. What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17? He said, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law. No. I've come not to abolish the law or the prophets, but I've come to fulfill them." And then he teases it out a little bit further, especially in relation to this passage in Matthew chapter 10, where he says, "Whoever loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves his son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up his cross daily and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake, he will find it." This is a passage Moses was commanding the people of Israel who were fixing to go into the land on the other side of the Jordan, the promised land, and they were going to capture the vineyards which they did not plant. They were going to harvest the crops which they did not sow. They would take possession of the wine presses which they did not build, and the cities which they did not build. Here we are today. We have no cities to take capture of. We have no wine presses that we are going to inherit that we did not build. We don't have those crops that we're going to sow, that we're going to reap, that we did not sow. But the timeless principle that is in this passage is very clear. The worship of God must be more than the worship of our families. Let me repeat that. The worship of God must be more than the worship of our families. Don't get me wrong and don't hear me wrong. I, of all people, will be the first to tell you that my family is one of the most important things in my entire life. It's more important than any job I will ever hold. It's more important than any ministry position that I will ever serve in. Scripture is clear: if a man cannot keep his own household, he's not worthy to serve as a minister. That's what 1 Timothy says. So my family is of utmost importance to me. But I have to keep that in perspective, because my family is only temporal for here and now. Because one day when I die and my heart stops beating and my lungs stop inhaling air, I'll stand before the Lord, and I will neither be married nor given in marriage, but I'll be like the angels. Our families are temporal, and we must treat them very importantly. Moses has already addressed that in chapter 6, where I read it from. But more important than our families, we must maintain our relationship with the Lord. Now, teasing that out into a wider application. I know that in a crowd this large today, I will guarantee you there is someone here that is in an unhealthy relationship that is not honoring the Lord. I don't want to see you on the 10 o'clock news because you went out and stoned whoever that person is. But you need to get right with the Lord. That relationship is bringing you down a path that you don't want to go down. An old minister in Louisiana that I heard preach many times, he always used to say, sin will take you further than you want to go. It'll keep you there longer than you want to stay, and it'll cost you more than you want to pay. And that's exactly what those relationships will do in your life. You see, when we're broken and we're wanting some sort of security, the first threat that we saw was one that we can grasp hold of, is that leader who can lead us where we want to go. That second threat is one that, well, it makes us feel gratified. But the third threat that we see, it's one of being countercultural. It's one of going against the flow. The third threat that we see this morning are those communities and organizations. They replace God with idols. Now, we didn't cover it, but one of the things I wanted you to notice in the second threat was how he said to do it. The first thing they were to do is, whoever it was, so for instance, if my wife had come to me and said, hey, let's go worship this other God. You notice what Moses tells them to do? He says, you go out and you be the one who leads the stoning of that. So you are the one who's responsible for you. You need to take the first step. But did you notice the second part of that? He said, the community needs to step in and be a support system for that. And that's the reason this third threat is so dangerous. Because sometimes our communities, the people that we're involved with, whether they be the churches, the Sunday school classes, the civic organizations such as the Lions Club, or whatever other civic organization that you're a part of, a sports team, a social group, they can be bad influences on our life. Read with me in verse 12. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to dwell there, that certain worthless fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you have not known. Then you shall inquire and make search and ask diligently. And behold, if it be true and certain that such abomination has been done among you, you shall surely put the inhabitants of that city to the sword, devoting it to destruction, all who are in it, and its cattle with the edge of the sword. Verse 16. You shall gather all of its spoil into the midst of the open square, and burn the city, and all of its spoil with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And it shall be a heap forever, and it shall not be built again. None of the devoted things shall stick to your hand, that the Lord may turn from his fierceness of his anger, and show mercy and have compassion on you, and multiply you, as he swore to your fathers. If you obey the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments that I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. Once again, we see somewhat the problem, these communities who are leading people away from the Lord, and we see again the solution. You're to cut yourself off from them because the Lord has promised that he'll take care of you. One of the things when we start looking at the communities and organizations that lead us away from God, I want you to notice something here in the text that you may not have caught the first time that we read it. I'm just going to hit some highlights for you, starting in verse number 12. He said, if you hear. And then he goes on to say, these people are saying that. And then verse 14, what does he say you should do? He said, you shall inquire, and you shall search out diligently to make sure that the accusations are true. Often in communities and organizations where things are going awry, what's the first thing that people like to start doing? We like to start blaming other people. We like to say, well, such and such did that. And such, well, they're being a little dishonest with the money. Or, man, they sure caused some strife. And then automatically, we just want to discredit anything that organization, that Sunday school class, anything they do without searching it out and knowing for a fact whether it's true. The first thing that you must do if you're going to be on guard with these threats and you're going to look for this community that's going to lead you away from these idols, lead you away to these idols, the first thing you have to do is you have to check all the facts. There are some organizations that do many, many good things. I'm probably going to step on some toes here, and I'm probably going to make some people mad. If so, you can meet me in the parking lot after, or you can meet me down here, and I'll be more than happy to talk about it with you. My grandmother had polio when she was 2 years old. When she had polio, she was rushed, and she spent probably the next year of her life in the Shriners Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Shriners, they do a lot of great things. The Masonic Lodge, they are a great civic organization, and they provide a lot of good things. But both of those organizations, you're required to take an oath to a God that is not the God of the Bible. Now, I say that, and the reason I brought up the point of you are to search out diligently and you are to inquire and ask these questions is because I have been told that my entire life. Now, it could be easy for me just to say, okay, well, somebody told me that. I'm going to accept it. I'm going to buy it as is. But no. When I was a senior in high school, I received an award from the local Masonic Lodge. And part of that award, I was invited to come up to one of their ceremonies. And after the fact, a few weeks later, I was asked if I was interested in maybe pursuing that more. Well, my grandfather, my dad's dad, he was actually a Mason. I don't know how much he actually had ever explored it or knew it, but it was a civic organization. He was a member of the United States Forest Service. He liked doing good for things for people, and he was a member of it. So I thought, well, my grandpa was part of it, so maybe I should explore this out to see if it's something worth getting involved in. And you know what? The very things I had been told my entire life, they were true. Perhaps you've been asked to join a business merger or a group. You need to search out, number one, the hearts of those men to make sure that they're following the same Lord as you are. Scripture is very clear. It's very unwise to yoke yourself with someone who has a different worldview system than you do. You need to search that out. You need to look at the facts of the situation. But the second thing after inquiring that I want you to look at is you're to do it surely. You're to do it with certainty. Did you notice that in verse 15? He said, "You're to surely put these things away, devoting them to destruction." The language of that passage in the original text means you are to do it with as certainty as you breathe air. Put them away. There are three areas that we really need to look at when we start looking at these communities that lead us to idols. The first one is one that I will admit that I struggled with. The first area we have to look at is how that community has infiltrated the way that we think and who we are as individuals. I grew up playing baseball. I don't know if I would say that I was very good at it, but I was good enough that I, as a junior in high school, had the opportunity to commit to Louisiana Tech University in Ruston, Louisiana, to play baseball with them. It was around that time that the Lord began to convict me of going into the ministry. It's something I had struggled with for about a year, and it's around that all that began to take place that the Lord began to work on my heart about going into the ministry. And so I'm here today, so you can make the connection. I surrendered my life to ministry, not knowing what that entailed. Well, for a while I toyed with the idea of going to Louisiana Tech, and I can still play baseball. I was going to be an engineer. I was going to get my civil engineering degree at Louisiana Tech. And I was going to play baseball, and great ministry opportunity. I mean, if you've been around baseball players, they need Jesus just as well as everybody else does. So, I thought, this is a great opportunity. And the Lord said, no, that's not what I want you to do. So I ended up feeling led that I need to go to Louisiana College, which is a small Baptist school, Division III in central Louisiana. Not a problem to play baseball there, so I was going to go and get me a little bit of Bible education. They teach some Bible classes there, and I was going to play baseball once again. Great opportunity to minister. First week of fall practice, the Lord began tugging at my heart and convicting me. You've made this a God. You have let this community influence who you are. You have let this community influence the way you think, the way you talk, the people that you're willing to hang around. You need to cut it off. I walked into the coach's office. I told him that I didn't feel that I needed to play baseball, and I hung up my cleats. Now, am I saying that baseball is an evil sport? No, I still love baseball. I love watching it, and one day, hopefully, that my son Wyatt, who's 16 months old, hopefully he'll play baseball. If he's good enough, maybe he'll play for LSU. If he's not, he'll play for Arkansas. I had to get one of those in. I love the game of baseball. But that community had become so much a part of me that even as someone called to the Lord, it was leading me away from the Lord. There are guys who do it, and they do it well. I believe that one of your own here, Craig Gentry, I feel that he plays baseball well, and he's a strong light and a strong testimony for the Lord. I have no doubts in my mind that it is possible to do it, but it was something that had taken root in my heart. What are those individual communities and groups that you're a part of that influence how you talk and the people you're willing to hang around? When you start identifying those, you'll identify those idols in your life. The second area that we need to look at this in is, well, how does this affect us within a body of believers? Are there any groups here in this church that are cliquish? That if someone were to walk into your Sunday school class or your care group or whatever you want to call it, would they feel welcomed? More than likely, if they don't feel welcome, the problem is that you've got your focus away from the Lord and you've made your focus more about socializing and being part of a group. There's nothing wrong at all with being a close Sunday school class. A matter of fact, I think that you should have close Sunday school classes. And people should take care of one another. If you're in the hospital, you should call them. You should take care of them. but not just the people that are already there. You should be constantly reaching out to bring others into the fold, because the Lord is the common bond. The Lord is the one who has brought you together, and it's the Lord who will keep you strong and keep you together. The third group that you need to look at, and the third area that we have in our life, are those things, those communities and groups that we're involved in an everyday type of sense. Recently, I was talking with a physician in Fort Worth who's originally from Rogers, Arkansas. And he was a practicing physician in Rogers for a while. He was originally a pediatrician. And he served as a pediatrician for about 5 or 6 years. And after that, he got out of that and he became an ER doctor. And he served as an ER doctor for over 20 years until the point where he retired. And he's still doing some medical things, but he's now retired. And I asked him, what made you want to really get away from doing pediatrics and get into ER medicine? And he looked at me and he said, well, to be honest with you, the gentleman that I had started the pediatric office with, I was a young believer and I really didn't know a whole lot. But he said, as I began to grow in the Lord, I began to see some things, some areas that could not mesh because they were unbelievers. I did the right thing and I told him I would like to get out of the practice. I gave him sufficient time, and he said, I left. Because the way they were doing business would eventually affect who he was. In your everyday life, whether it's a business that you're a part of, whether it's the job you do, whether it's the school you go to, the youth group you hang out with, the sport you play, that overarching group is, are you influencing that group, or is that group influencing you? You see, these people, they wanted something to believe in. The people in Deuteronomy, they were looking for something to hope in. And the principle that Moses is telling them is that they need to remember God, and they have to remember His Word. Because if they don't, they're not going to be able to recognize and to remove those temptations. Today, maybe you've sat here and this entire time you've thought, well, I'm pretty smart about who I follow. I can recognize a leader pretty well, and it's not for me. Maybe you've thought, well, I'm a believer. My entire family is a believer. My kids are a believer. I don't have to worry about those relationships at all. Maybe you've thought, well, I'm a hermit. I don't really get out in the community, so I don't have to worry about those community groups. Or maybe you've thought, well, I am the leader. I am the person who really influences those community groups, so I don't have to worry about them influencing me. In 1967, there was a history teacher by the name of Ron Jones. Ron Jones taught at Coverly High School in Palo Alto, California. He taught the subject of world history. In teaching a particular area of world history, he decided to conduct a social experiment. Part of this social experiment, he was going to employ many of the techniques that a certain period of time and certain party had used at gaining control over the mass population, just to help his students get an idea of how this could happen. So he had 3 things that he would get them to say. When they saw each other, they would greet each other: strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. He would designate certain parts of his classes as those who were to be monitors, who were to ensure the purity of the group, that they were greeting each other as they should, and that they were giving the handshake as they should. Aside from just his classes, they were to go out and to proselytize the rest of the school and bring others into this national youth movement, is what he told them. He had 6 classes of about 30 students apiece. 180 students, right? This was a school that had about 1,000 students. Within 3 days, the entire school was a part of this youth movement called the Third Wave. This is a true story. It had gotten so bad that riots were ensuing because others were not becoming part of the group. That they were corrupting the purity of the group. It got so bad that on the fourth day, he talked to the principal, and they had a school-wide assembly where they all met in the auditorium, and they were all going to see a speech from this national youth movement, the leader. The student body, they all sat in an auditorium larger than this, and they all sat there restless as they were waiting. The monitor standing at each one of the walkways, making sure that no one got in that wasn't supposed to be in. They began to get restless. And suddenly a picture, a video popped up on the TV screen. Do you know who it was? It was Mr. 1938. Adolf Hitler. That's a true story. A movie was made of it in 1981 called The Wave that details how this had happened. And the main reason that Mr. Jones had decided to do this was because as he was talking about Nazi Germany, his classes, every single one of them would say, we would never do that. We would never sell out our friends. We would never sell our families. And it took him how many days? 3 days. And the entire school had been converted to the fascism of Nazism. This morning, I want to ask you a question. Moses is clear as he talks to these people, and he says, there are no idols. You have none of them. You must guard your relationships. Be alert. Be aware. As Peter tells us, our adversary is a roaring lion, roaming, seeking whom he may devour. Paul writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10, and he tells them, be alert, be diligent, look for those areas of temptation and remove them. My question this morning is simply this. As you look at your life, number one, are there any areas in your life that have led you away from your relationship with Jesus Christ? If you know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, is there anything that is affecting you and influencing you to not act like Christ? The second question that I want to ask you, if that's not the case with you, have you ever even established a relationship with Christ? You see, these people, they were hopeless and they were wanting something to grab hold of and something to hold tightly onto. And it was supposed to be the promise of the Lord that He was going to provide for them, that He was going to save them, that He was going to make them a great people. And we ultimately see, like I said before, that they still didn't get it. And every single one of us today, we want something to hope in. We want something to believe in. Some of us try to get that hope through getting more money. Some of us try to get that hope and some of that reward by working more and having a better job. Some of us even try to get it through church. We like to come and be a part of an organization. But ultimately, the only hope you can have is the hope that will not disappoint, and that is Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. This morning, I'm fixing to ask us all to stand and I'm going to pray. We're going to have a song of invitation. If you need to get right with the Lord, whether to get a relationship with Him and know Him as your personal Lord and Savior and have that hope, or whether you need to confess a sin and get some help for one of these areas, one of these idols that you have taken hold of in your life, today is the day. Now is the time.